Applause to Mrs. Nicole Anderson as she gives us the UNODC perspective. You're welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Do we have the presentation slides? Yep. Oh, perfect. Thank you very much. So, good morning, everyone. My name is Nicole Anderson, and I am an Associate Program Officer with UNODC's Counterterrorism Program. I think many of you in the room working in law enforcement are very familiar with UNODC, but for those who aren't, I'll just give a short introduction. We are a small, specialized agency focused on combating transnational crime, drug trafficking, and terrorism through strengthening the criminal justice system. So really, our focus is working with law enforcement, with prosecutors, with defense counsel to improve the criminal justice system in countries around the world. In Nigeria, the Counterterrorism Project, which I am representing today, has been an active participant in this process for over a decade. We've been working closely with the Nigeria Police Force, with the Armed Forces, with DSS, and with the Federal Ministry of Justice to help move forward the prosecution of terrorism-related cases. Today, though, I want to talk about a specialized area of our work, which is forensics. And we've really come to adopt an approach on forensics in Nigeria from understanding the need for evidential material to be presented in terrorism-related cases. Can we move to the next slide? But what I really want to anchor the presentation in first is our understanding of expectation versus reality. And this is something that I think we should approach not from the perspective of trying to criticize what currently exists, but to help us identify the challenges that are before us. Oftentimes when we meet, even with senior law enforcement, with senior advisors to the government, there's an expectation that what is happening in Nigeria is already aligned with an international standard, similar to what you see on the left. The application of crime scene kits, the use of bags and other materials, and the proper storage and maintenance of chain of custody. However, in reality, UNODC, we are often in the field, we are engaged with the police force, with NDLEA, with many other agencies. What we've encountered is more of what you might see on the right. And what I want to be specific about here is to say that there's nothing wrong with this, because we understand that the challenges facing Nigeria are immense. And these challenges often are much more significant than those that those facing countries that currently practice forensics, as evidenced on the left. Nigeria has a very large population. The investment and resources that are available to law enforcement are comparatively limited. In addition, we're looking at a rate and severity of many crimes that is more significant than what we see today in the Western world. So I want to really stress that in this presentation, I will show a few more examples, but this is not at all intended as a criticism of the challenges that Nigeria faces. What we do as UNODC is we look at this problem and we approach it by thinking, what can we do with the resources that are at our disposal? While on a political level, we continue to advocate for more investment in forensics, more investment in law enforcement, what can we already do today to help move this process forward and to bring more recognition to forensics in Nigeria? And what we understand is there are three critical challenges that we need to look at first. These include collection, storage, and record keeping, and I'll show you a few examples to understand how we can move this conversation forward. Can we move? Yeah, perfect. So collection. When we start looking at the challenges around collection of evidence in Nigeria, and most of these examples, I want to say, are also from our work with the Nigeria Police Force, which is the entity that my project works with most closely. Some of the key challenges that we see, first of all, are where is the evidence collected? You may notice in these pictures we have a lot of weapons. A lot of these weapons are taken off of suspects at the moment of arrest. What we are not necessarily seeing is a lot of pieces of evidence that are picked up at the crime scene. In addition, there's a lack, obviously, of proper materials to store evidence correctly, to maintain the quality and integrity that would allow it to be subjected to a forensic process. There's nothing wrong with having evidence in this form. Evidence in this form is often used as provenance in court. You know, a statement from a police officer, for example, can also help to strengthen this type of evidence. However, in this discussion, we're talking about moving forward the forensic process in Nigeria. And for that, there are some additional steps that need to be considered. Another point is just the topic of human error, of training. For most forensic professionals in Nigeria, the training provided is not enough, and I think many of us in the room recognize that. And really what we see is that there's a lack of attention to forensics that results in the lack of further investment in the training that is necessary to help you to move these processes forward. Can we move to the next slide? What I want to illustrate in this photo, these are some more examples of evidence that we've seen, is I find that these are very positive examples of how we can improvise. And this is something that UNODC over the last 5 years has started to encourage in our training. Can we use local materials? How can local packaging materials be used to preserve evidence in a way that may help us to use it for forensic purpose? How can we write labels by hand? Perhaps we do not have the materials to provide an evidence sticker, but as you see, this is a very proper evidence label provided by hand in a police storage facility. So my point here is to illustrate that there are things that we can do already to help us move forward. And I don't think that the absence of certain materials that you would see in a crime scene kit or similar should be any reason to think that the process is not possible. Next slide. So now we move on to storage challenges. What we see in many cases, and I think many of you are familiar with this, the criminal justice system in Nigeria is slow. This may mean that many cases don't come to court quickly and evidence piles up. This is not the fault of the law enforcement agencies, but it's a simple fact that there are cases in court that are requiring evidence that dates back 10 years or more. The exhibit keepers often face an immense challenge, here's one of our exhibit keepers on the right, in maintaining the evidence store and keeping order to this system. In addition, depending on the location, you know, some of the evidence storage facilities that we've worked with are in remote locations. There may be issues around lack of power, ventilation. Now we're looking at climate change. You know, how the natural elements may affect the evidence that is stored. In addition, the role of the exhibit keeper is not often prioritized, and they don't necessarily receive additional training or support on the best way to manage their store and their resources. Finally, we often ask the question, where should the evidence go if there are no forensic processes that are taking place? Many people think that the evidence will move to court at some point, but the other side of the equation, the forensic side, is missing. In many cases, this evidence would leave the store and come back multiple times because it would go to a laboratory. It would be exploited there and then returned to the store. But in this case, many of these pieces of evidence are sitting for years without further use. Can we move to the next? This is just another picture to illustrate some more of our storage challenges. At times, the evidence store has actually been in a storage container, for example, which you can imagine in the heat what this can do to the materials inside. Next. Then we look at record-keeping challenges. In Nigeria, we're using a lot of paper records that can deteriorate quickly and can be difficult to reference. However, I would like to stress here as well that there is a clear process in place, and we respect the use of paper records. However, it's important for us to look at alternatives that can help us to reference this information faster. You know, many of the forensic laboratories that UNODC is looking to support are located in major cities. It may be difficult for the exhibit keepers or other personnel in the CID to figure out where the forensic process that they need support for can take place. And similarly, the forensic labs do not have a system to see what kind of materials may be needing exploitation. So this is another area that we look at. Then the laboratories. Nigeria actually has some pretty good forensic laboratories, but they're not in constant use. And that touches on some of the problems that I've already enumerated around collection and storage. In the laboratories, what we see often is a lack of consistent power source, something that we hope can be rectified quickly with solar. We see issues with tampering with the equipment, or the equipment provided often by international donors is not actually adequate to the processes that are needed. Another challenge is, can we go to the next slide? How do we ensure a regular supply of consumables? In these photos, we see different chemicals that are required in a forensic laboratory. However, some of them are expired. In fact, UNODC, we see this as an issue of lack of use. And this is not the fault of the laboratory. In fact, much of the evidence is not reaching the laboratory. So it's difficult for them to use the resources that are available to them in a timely manner, and then to restock and supply. So this is another issue we are thinking about. So, now we've gotten through the difficult part. We come to the future. At UNODC, we see the issue of forensic readiness as an issue of supply and demand. As I mentioned, in the field, a lot of the evidence that is collected is not collected in a way that is maintaining the chain of custody. Beyond that, the evidence is not reaching a forensic laboratory because many people have given up on the idea that a forensic process can take place. On the other side, there's the issue of demand. The prosecutors have become accustomed to looking for the provenance evidence, but not asking for forensic evidence. So they are not creating the demand for the law enforcement to invest in these resources. And we see this as a critical issue and something that we encourage the prosecutors to consider. If they ask for these resources, then the attention of law enforcement, like the Nigeria Police Force, can be prioritized to these issues. In addition, there's a lack of awareness around the resources that do exist. In the forensic laboratory in Lagos, there is the opportunity to do document examination, handwriting comparison, and ballistics, but many of these processes are not taking place. We have seen that there are a few hundred requests per year for these types of services in a country of hundreds of millions. Our approach is to consider that we need to unseize the gears all at once. In this picture, you see the 5 parts of the evidence chain. It is our view that we need to get all of these elements together in order to improve forensics in Nigeria. And UNODC is partnering closely with a number of the federal agencies to help encourage this. We start with evidence collection. In the last years, we've helped to renovate a number of evidence storage facilities, and we've also helped to develop standard operating procedures, as were mentioned, I think, also in the comments from Honorable Justice Paul, the need for these standardized procedures. Then I mentioned evidence storage, evidence transfer. How do we move evidence around the country? We're currently working with the Nigeria Police Force to think about how we can do this. Can we encourage a courier service just for forensic evidence to help move the evidence out of remote areas to the laboratories? Then evidence exploitation. How do we ensure that there are professionals who can assist these processes without the need for those professionals because the evidence is not reaching the lab? Those resources, again, those human resources are not prioritized. And then we come to court presentation. which is the aspect that we work on with the prosecutors, to help them understand the forensic processes that already are taking place in Nigeria, those that can take place in the future, and to encourage them to ask for evidence, forensic evidence, to be included in the case files that they review. We also are looking at this as a phased approach. Next slide. Our idea about building forensic capacity in Nigeria is to look at this as a tiered or phased process. In the first tier, we focus on improving basic collection techniques and some of the more basic forensic processes, including ballistic comparison, handwriting, document examination. As I mentioned, these are all already available in Nigeria. And digital evidence, which the Honorable Justice talked about in his remarks as well, which is another process that is ongoing in many institutions. In the second tier, which is the tier that we see that we are in right now, we hope to improve expertise around fingerprinting, tool marks, footwear marks, tire marks, seriology, exploitation of hairs and fibers, and drug analysis. Currently, UNODC is supporting the development of an expert center in Maiduguri with the police on fingerprinting, and we hope to build out more regional hubs in the future in this area of expertise. In the final tier, we move on to DNA and chemical analysis, but many of you know DNA requires significant financial resources and expertise, so we've left that for the third tier. Obviously, questions remain about how we can solve certain issues around the supply of the consumables, about the renewing of for digital evidence. And these are all issues that UNODC is looking at closely in partnership with the Nigeria Police Force and our other law enforcement agencies. We hope to solve these with a local solution. I want to touch also quickly on the expertise required to present evidence in court. Now, Nigerian legislation does not specify exactly what qualifies as an expert in court. However, next slide. What you see on the slide here are guidelines based on international practice about what would qualify someone to be an expert in fingerprinting, in handwriting, in digital evidence, or other. I know many of you in the room are the people that are involved in these processes and these trainings. But what I want to illustrate is that for some of these processes, the amount of experience needed is relatively small. Whereas for other processes, it requires a huge investment. And so we want to really prioritize first the types of forensic processes that require less experience. Often 1 or a few years of experience with the passing of a certification is sufficient to present evidence in court. Go to the next slide. Here we look at some of the more advanced processes. And that's the point that we want to illustrate. These processes would come later in the third tier. Next slide. So, the way forward. A few recommendations from UNODC based on our experience. And I will say, obviously, our experience is limited. We've been working closely on forensics for the last 5 years, but many of you have been working on these issues far, far longer. However, some recommendations that we've seen in our work would be, first of all, the development of SOPs, a standardization for evidence collection, packaging, labeling for law enforcement. And ideally, these would be